We've been in a sermon series over the past few weeks called The Characters of Christmas. We've looked at Mary, we've looked at Zechariah and Elizabeth, we've looked at some of the angels in the Christmas story, mainly in the Christmas story the way Luke tells it. And today we turn our attention to another character. Not one of the foreground characters, but one of the background characters. It's typical maybe to focus on the characters who were closest to the action, but there are other characters in the Christmas story who play a necessary role even if they don't show up in the nativity scene. And even if they themselves are ignorant of the role that they play in the story. And so when Luke was narrating the birth of Jesus, when he came to this point in his gospel in Luke chapter 2, the first character that he mentions is actually Caesar Augustus, the emperor of Rome. Luke didn't have to write his story in this way. He didn't have to mention Caesar Augustus. In fact, none of the other gospel writers mention Caesar. Only in Luke's gospel does his name appear. In fact, his name only appears one time in the whole of the New Testament. So he's never mentioned in connection with anything else that has to do with Jesus. And so we have Caesar Augustus as the first character here. And for some reason, when it came to this part of the story, Luke wanted to set side by side the most powerful man in the world at this time, Caesar Augustus, with Jesus born in a stable, laid in a manger. It's how Luke wanted to tell the story. And he sets the scope and the scale of the story on the scale and the stage of the entire world, with international politics and emperors and all of the politics of the day setting the scene before he narrows the scope to just a baby in Bethlehem. And one of the things that I love about the Christmas story, especially the way that Luke tells the story, is that it's such a good example of God dipping down into the seeming randomness of life and the chaos of life and the insignificance of this or that circumstance, and reminding the world that history is unfolding according to God's plan, that history moves forward at God's pace and in his timing. The Christmas story is a picture of how God engineers and designs the seemingly random circumstances of life, the random events of history into the story that God is telling. You see, Christmas came to pass in a specific time, in a specific place. There were specific people involved. Now see, there were also specific historical settings and contexts surrounding Jesus' birth. And just like the history that we live in, the history surrounding Jesus' birth probably looked chaotic and random to the people there on the ground in Bethlehem that night. We know that because, of course, that's how life looks to all of us sometimes. The events of life just seem kind of random. They don't always seem connected. Whenever life hands us something that we weren't expecting, something painful maybe, the one thing we can't ever seem to find is a satisfactory answer to the question, why? We might even look at other people's lives and think, why did they get sick and not me? Why did I lose my job and not him? Why did that person die and not this other person? Because it would have made more sense if it was the other way around. And yet, why do we think that it should make sense? Isn't it strange a little bit, really? Regardless of what you believe, it's not just a Christian thing. This is just a people thing. That regardless of what you believe, usually we find ourselves digging around in the events of life looking for some kind of purpose in it. Looking for a connection somehow, asking the question, why? And something about the Christmas story resonates with something deep within us, because in it we see just a glimpse of the grand design that God is weaving out of the fabric of history. Let's listen to how Luke tells the story in Luke chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. And while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. And she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. Now you see how Luke doesn't just start with that night in Bethlehem. Luke starts this scene in Luke 2:1 with, in those days, Caesar Augustus. He starts with the context of world powers, and then there's a progression from the Roman world to down to Syria, where he mentions the governor of Syria, and then down to Galilee and Nazareth, and then Judea and Bethlehem. This way of kind of setting the context of the story invites us to wonder about the scale and the scope of Jesus' significance. Who is this baby that's going to be born here? Is there a possibility of this birth having redemptive significance, not just for Galilee and Judea, but maybe for all of Syria, maybe for the whole world? And yet, on the ground in Bethlehem, this all would have seemed a bit unplanned. Having to have the baby, having to deliver the baby while you're traveling, that's like the worst case scenario. You had to take a last minute trip somewhere because of a deadline required by the government. That would be like the IRS requiring everybody to make a trip to your hometown before the April 15th filing deadline. And you're pregnant, and maybe you wait as close as you can get to the April 15th deadline, and you think maybe the baby will come before then, and we can travel, after we have the baby. But no, we kind of put it off, and now, no, we got to go because April 15th is the deadline. The ideal would be to have everything ready. You don't want to be away from home. Candace and I did this once. We know this because we have 4 kids. When our second was born, we were in an Italian restaurant about 30 minutes away from home when Candace went into labor. And I threw the credit card down and was like, we got to get out of here. We got to drive 30 minutes home and then an hour to the hospital. And we had to drop off our oldest son at home with the babysitter before driving to the hospital. So, and we barely made it to the hospital. So we didn't repeat that. When the baby got close, the next 2 times, we stayed really close to home. But here are Mary and Joseph traveling, and all they see are no vacancy signs. Was it a hastily put together trip? No time to arrange for a place to sleep? The whole thing looks terribly unplanned. Maybe this has happened to you. Have you ever been traveling, been on a trip, and realized that you forgot to plan a key detail of your travel? I remember my wife and I, Candace, when we were very young, we were just married at 19. We got married really young. We were just married, and we were going to stay in a hotel, and it was the first time since our honeymoon that we were going to stay in a hotel. And we were on the way to a wedding in Odessa, and we were in Dallas, and it was late, and we didn't want to drive through the night, so we just thought, hey, we can do this. We're married now. We can get a hotel. So we walk in, and they turn us away. Not because there was no vacancy. Oh, they had plenty of rooms. They turned us away because there had to be an adult in the room. And an adult meant that you had to be 21 to stay there. And we did not meet their classification of adult because we were 19. And by the way, they probably didn't believe us because we looked like 15, 13, 15. She looked 15. I looked 13 for sure. Yeah. They're like, who are these kids and where are your parents? Is that what they told Mary and Joseph? Like, you should have planned better. You should have checked beforehand. You should have called ahead. The town is packed. Why didn't you get here earlier? Well, I suppose you could stay with the animals. A lot of houses had little shelters for the animals. It'd be like a garage or a parking lot. You got to have some place to put your transportation. And that's what animals were. They were transportation. So we keep them in a little side house. We call it a garage, but they just called it a stable. And that's how it was. To the people there in Bethlehem that night, maybe it looked unplanned. Maybe it looked chaotic. A whole nation having to travel because of some census. To the people in the midst of the story, maybe they didn't see where all this was headed, but Luke knew. And Luke, he knew it wasn't random. 700 years before this, before there was even a Roman Empire, the prophet Micah was moved by the Lord to write a prophecy about the Messiah. And every Jewish person at this time would have read this prophecy of Micah, that from you out of Bethlehem, even though you're small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me a ruler who will rule over my people Israel, a ruler whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. And Luke knew that it all wasn't just a random collection of events. It wasn't unplanned. He knew that somehow the decree that came down from none other than Caesar Augustus himself had been timed exactly right, exactly where God intended them to be that night, to put Mary and Joseph in Bethlehem. Luke mentions actually the census 4 times in these verses, that they go to register because of the census. He's purposefully setting next to one another, juxtaposing the world of Caesar Augustus with the world of divine purpose. Now, we don't recognize the name Caesar Augustus, really. We don't know who that is, but Luke's readers knew. They knew very well. Caesar Augustus was born in 63 BC. His given name was Gaius Octavius, so he's usually called Octavian. You may have heard of Octavian before. Well, Octavian was the son of Julius Caesar's niece, which means he was born in high places as the great nephew to a very powerful Roman general. And as we learned in school, Julius Caesar was assassinated on the steps of the Roman Senate, March 15th, 44 BC. And Octavian was 19 years old at the time, and it was revealed in Julius's will when he died. He had a particular affinity for the young Octavian, and so he had adopted him as his only legitimate son, which means Octavian would be the heir to all of Julius Caesar's titles and land, which was considerable. And so at this point, Octavian took on his great uncle's title and became known as Gaius Julius Caesar. And in the years following, Octavian began to change the basic structure of the Roman Republic. It became an empire. After the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Octavian defeated Mark Antony and became the sole ruler of the Roman world, which made him Rome's first empire, Rome's first emperor, and in this way, Rome became an empire. He actually changed the constitution of Rome, and he kept the Senate. He kept some power still in the Senate, and it was at this time that the Senate voted to, endow Julius Caesar with the name the Divine Julius. The Senate could vote on these things, and just make you a divine figure, and so they did. They voted, and anytime you called Julius Caesar, Julius Caesar would be known as the Divine Julius. And this, of course, meant that Octavian, as the adopted son of the Divine Julius, would be known around the world, the Roman world at least, as the son of the divine, or the son of a god. And it was then that he received the name Augustus, which means sacred, or venerated, or worshipful. It's a word, it's a religious term, actually. It kind of has a connotation of worship. That's probably why Luke didn't translate it from its Latin Augustus into the Greek Sabastos. He probably didn't want to condone the use of the word worshipful for Augustus, so he just leaves it untranslated as a name in Latin. It was meant to remind people of his connection to the divine as the son of a god. There was even an inscription that we found called the Marian inscription, and Octavian is called the Divine Augustus, son of a god and savior of the whole world. And indeed, Octavian was a keen political ruler. He ushered in a time of peace that was unparalleled in the ancient world. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was a golden age. It lasted for 200 years. He put an end to all these civil wars. He expanded this massive network of Roman roads so that somebody could be in their whole lifetime born and die in relative peace and be able to travel from one side of the empire to the other on roads in safety, all within the same nation. And along with this, trade and prosperity increased. And so Octavian wanted to establish a system for taxation in the whole empire. There had never been a census of the entire Roman world, including the provinces, before. And in the past, getting a count of people was nearly impossible. And so it was kind of imprecise the way that you collected taxes, especially in the provinces like Judea. So for reasons that we'll probably never know, Caesar Augustus decided to change the tax structure of the empire and start taxing individuals, which required them to register. Not just once, but at regular intervals in a census. Every so many years, probably. And this is why it seems that Luke is telling us which census. This was the first census while Quirinius was governor, because these censuses would have continued through the people reading Luke's gospel 100 years later. They would have had several of these, and he was telling them the first one while Quirinius was governor. That's when this happened. But little did Caesar Augustus know that with all of his power and all of his authority to command the whole Roman Empire with a decree, his census was just the setup for God's story. His census would become the backdrop, just the context, the setting in a story about Joseph leaving Nazareth to go to Bethlehem with Mary. To be there at just the right time. It was critical that Joseph and Mary go to Bethlehem so that they would be there when the Messiah was born, so that the prophecy of Micah would come to pass. And little did Caesar Augustus know that he was being moved to do, by the Spirit of God, to do exactly what he did. On time, on God's schedule, to effect exactly the result that God wanted, so that, as Paul says in Galatians 4, Jesus' coming would be in the fullness of time. In the fullness of time. When the conditions were exactly right, there were a few days when Mary and Joseph had to be in Bethlehem, right at the very time of the birth of the child. And God knew exactly what day that was and what time that was. What made Julius Caesar adopt Octavian? What transpired so that Julius was assassinated and Octavian came to power exactly when he did? What made him change the tax structure of the empire? Any number of things could have transpired and interrupted the plan, and Jesus probably wouldn't have been born in Bethlehem. The sheer number of things that God had to arrange are staggering. God knew how long it would take to get the registration machinery in place. God knew to establish the bureaucracy that would be required for a census like this in Judea. And God knew what sort of deadlines would be put in place for the province of Judea, because this could be a process that could take years. God knew all of that. Every single detail was in the hand of Almighty God. And God still directs history, and he still holds every king and every ruler in his hand for his purposes. And on one level, the journey to Bethlehem is because the almighty decree of Augustus. But Luke knew, on the other hand, that even the most powerful ruler in the world at that time is unwittingly a pawn made to serve a purpose that he knows nothing about, the purpose of God. And it's ironic, and Luke probably wrote this with a smirk, I'm sure, that the one who was called falsely the son of a god, that very one becomes a major player in bringing about the prophecy of the real Son of God. Caesar Augustus would never have imagined that all of the unprecedented infrastructure and roads and systems in the Roman Empire, that was just the setup for the gospel of the true Savior to be spread throughout the world. The conditions were perfect. It would have been inconceivable to Augustus that the city of Rome 2,000 years later would be a tourist attraction decorated with crosses. That would have blown his mind. Crosses everywhere you look. Would have been inconceivable to Augustus that every Christmas his name would be spoken all around the world, but not in reference to what he did, but only as a footnote in the story of a Jewish carpenter's trip to Bethlehem. But again, To the people in Bethlehem that night, this moment that was 700 years in the making looked rather unplanned. It all looked a little chaotic. And for some of you, you would say, Collin, in the past 2 or 3 weeks or the past 2 or 3 months, as I've approached this season, as I've approached the Christmas season, I've been handed something that I was not expecting. For some of you, it might have been a job loss. For some of you, all of a sudden, there's tension in a relationship, parent-child relationship, or a marriage relationship, or something's going on. You didn't see it coming. For some of you, you got bad news. Got bad news about your health, or the health of a child, or the health of a loved one. And for some of you, it's something at work. But whatever it is, now you're staring at something, and if you were honest, you would say, man, it's really difficult for me to trust God with this staring me in the face. I've been handed something I didn't expect, and it's very difficult to trust God because of all the uncertainty that this brings into my life. The uncertainty that it brings into my relationships, or my finances, or my career, or my future. But can you imagine saying to God, God, I can see that you can engineer and arrange the circumstances of the entire Roman Empire in order to bring a 700-year-old prophecy to fulfillment. But can you really manage my situation? Can you really manage my finances, or my health, or my relationships, my marriage, my future? Because whatever it is that has taken you by surprise, it didn't take God by surprise. Whatever it is that you would say, I don't know exactly what to do about this because it looks like there's nothing I can do. It looks like my hands are tied here, but God's hands are not tied. Yeah, my knowledge is limited, but God's knowledge isn't. And our strength is finite, sure, but God's power is not. And whatever it is that you would say, this was not part of the plan. This isn't how it was supposed to work out. Let me tell you this, just because it wasn't in your plan doesn't mean God doesn't have a plan. Just means you don't know it yet. And just because you don't see the purpose doesn't mean there is no purpose. It just means you don't see it yet. And whatever it is that you would say in your life, you'd say, really, God, I thought you were with me. If God was with me, this would not have happened to me. But if anyone in all of history could have said that, it would have been Mary. I mean, this is God with us, literally, in her womb, traveling to Bethlehem. And if God was with us, wouldn't you think we would have been able to find a place to stay for the night? Huh? If God was with us, would I have to have my baby and lay him in a manger? But God was most certainly with them in human form. And yet, here they are in a stable in Bethlehem. And it's interesting because as far as we know, an angel only appeared to Mary one time to explain what God was going to do. And never again did an angel appear to Mary. God never explained the other parts of the story to her except for Simeon's oracle. I can't imagine what Mary thought when she saw her son crucified. We have to think about that. She stood there and watched it. We know how it all worked out, but did she remember the words of the angel that said, his kingdom shall never end? The angel said he would reign forever. And yet Jesus' hands were tied. Jesus was bound. His strength was sapped. His power was restrained. And the limits of flesh were felt by the infinite God. And in those moments, it looked like another senseless act of Roman violence. Just looked random. Looked unplanned. And yet, had God lost control? No. This was at the very epicenter of God's activity. The very moment when it looked like everything was lost, that's when that was at the crosshairs of God's greatest involvement in the world as he sent his son into the world to pay the price for the sins of mankind. Have you taken a moment yet this Christmas to remember that all of it, Caesar's decree and Joseph's journey and Mary in the manger and Jesus in the cross, all of it was for you, was for me, it's for all of us, for anyone who would look through the chaos of it all and trust that behind it all is really God's mercy, God's grace, and God's love. Behind every other purpose in history stands God's love. Caesar decreed, but God's love determined the outcome. Joseph journeyed, but it was God's love that was steering and determined the destination. All the threads that make up the fabric of history, they're being woven together in a tapestry to display the grand design. And what's the grand design? The infinite and overwhelming love of God in the person of Jesus Christ. That's the grand design. That's what all of history is being woven together to display. It's God's love in the person of Jesus Christ. And at Christmas, we were reminded that even when it seems random, even when it seems purposeless, and even when it seems like this is an unredeemable illness or an unredeemable job loss or an unredeemable death or an unredeemable anything situation, there's nothing good that can come from this, God. There's no way this is part of an overarching plan. At Christmas, we're reminded, actually, God is working out his plan and his purpose in the randomness and in the chaos of the world and of our lives in a way and on a scale that we will never see in this life. But we can know one thing and we can trust one thing. Because of the manger and the cross, behind all of it stands God's mercy, God's grace, and ultimately, God's love. And we'll see that one day.